So we want to welcome you to One Bite at a Time. For those of you that have not had a chance to participate, this was a chance for us to take one topic in the science of nutrition and take a deep dive. Or rather than just, telling people just, have a well-balanced diet and have some fruits and vegetables, we thought that out of respect for your knowledge, it's worth taking a deeper dive and taking one little topic at a time. Megan, what were some of the topics? We've taken a topic on mushrooms and a whole discussion on mushrooms and its value in cancer survivorship. We talked about cooking methods and advanced glycosylation products and how that may be important for our well-being and health. And today, Megan's going to lead us on a discussion in phytonutrients, soy products. I know there's a lot of controversies and debates out there, particularly for our breast cancer survivors. I think Megan's going to really shed a lot of light and clarify a lot of the controversies. We are going to have an opportunity for Q&A. So please just, put in your questions in the chat. I'll try to moderate in the background as best I can. And I really want to, before she starts, salute Megan for taking on this project. She puts a lot of time into finding the most up-to-date science in these arenas and sharing it with the rest of us. So Megan, thank you for doing this, and the show is all yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And just to kind of clean up our screen, I'm going to take everyone's ability to turn their video on away, as well as mute everybody. And then I'll turn it off, back on when we finish for the Q&A. Well, that doesn't seem to have worked, but let's go with this. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, can y'all see that? Okay. Excellent. Thank you for the verbal confirmation. Let me just get set up here. Okay, great. So as Dr. Asher said, today's topic is phytoestrogens in foods and dietary supplements. I wanted to spend some time talking about the three big questions I get asked all the time in patient care and in the survivorship space about whether or not phytoestrogens cause cancer or fuel cancer cell growth, whether or not they can reduce menopausal hot flashes or hot flashes from hormone therapies, and is bioengineered soy safe to eat? Let's see. So I think some of the confusion about this comes from these terms being used so interchangeably, whether it's a phytoestrogen or an endocrine disruptor or an isoflavone. So I wanted to take some time to categorize some of these names to put it in perspective. So when we talk about estrogens, we're usually talking about endogenous estrogens. These are estrogens that our bodies make in both men and women. These are hormones, and these are synthesized in the ovaries, the testes, the adrenal cortex, and other tissues, including body fat. And we have our three main estrogens listed there. So these endogenous estrogens do bind to estrogen receptors, and they behave as an estrogen. Exogenous estrogens are estrogens that are from outside the body, and these can also bind to estrogen receptors and behave as an estrogen in the body. Xenoestrogens are synthetic industrial compounds. These can be found in things like plastics and consumer goods, preservatives, pesticides, insecticides. And some examples of those are parabens in cosmetics and some foods. You may be familiar with BPA or bisphenol A, which is found in plastic food containers, as well as other things like DDT, which is a pesticide. It's banned in the US, but it's still used in other parts of the world. And these are often referred to as endocrine disruptors because they can mimic estrogen. So they can block normal estrogen activity, and they've been associated with an increased risk of cancer. These are also considered environmental hazards that have a variable degree of impact, just depending on the amount, the level of exposure, and the length of exposure. But we're not going to spend a lot of time today talking about xenoestrogens. We'll save that topic for another time. Today, I want to talk about phytoestrogens, which are plant-based exogenous estrogens. And these share some structural features with ovarian estradiol and have weak estrogen-like activity. So they're less sensitive than the estrogen our body makes, but they still can behave as an estrogen. So just to create a visual for what estrogen receptors are, this is a very simplified image for a very complex subject. But throughout the body, there are cells with estrogen receptors, but the binding of estrogen to these receptors activates the cell's pathway. Sometimes these pathways can lead to genomic changes and contribute to the initiation or progression of cancer. And this can include hormone-sensitive breast cancer, prostate cancer, and other ones like colorectal, lung, and gastric cancers. And we know that phytoestrogens can block estradiol by taking up spots in the body's estrogen receptors. And this can prevent these cells from proliferating. The impact of estrogens is really dictated by the binding affinity towards these different subtypes of estrogen receptors, mostly alpha, as you can see pictured here, and beta. And these alpha receptors appear to play a pro-cancer role, whereas the beta receptors appear to play a tumor suppressive role. So the binding of phytoestrogens specifically to beta rather than alpha receptors may be what makes them cancer protective, but this is a theory that needs more research. I think it's also worth considering that there's a transient production of estrogen in the body over a lifetime during periods of puberty, if there's excessive body fat gained, hormone treatments, menopause. So it's really not known what the ideal time is for exposure, but studies do point to early exposure of phytoestrogens as being able to reduce risk of breast cancer later in life. So these are phytoestrogens categorized by their chemical names. This is not exhaustive, but I wanted to point out the different types here. So you can see phytoestrogens is a broad term that includes flavonoids, which are also called phytonutrients or phytochemicals, as well as non-flavonoids. And you can see these genistein and dadzian under soy isoflavones. We also have comestins, lignans, and stilbenes. You may recognize resveratrol up there. So the estrogen effects of these phytoestrogens is not as great as our soy, genistein, and dadzian. But these don't only have estrogenic effects. These also have antioxidant and other anti-cancer properties. And it may be more useful to look at these in terms of which foods they come from. And so we can see here our isoflavones mostly come from soybeans and other beans. We don't really eat these other foods here like red clover. And these are generally all cancer preventative foods. These are healthful foods, I would say, with the exception of red wine over here. And I think it's worth noting that all foods do contain some level of phytoestrogens. It's not just these foods. Phytoestrogens are found in dairy and eggs, chicken, meat, coffee, but comparatively, soy has the highest concentrations. So just to kind of give a brief history of phytoestrogens as they relate to breast cancer and to talk about why where some of this confusion started. In the early 1900s, genistein and dadzian were first identified. And then in the 50s and 60s, scientists established a binding affinity of isoflavones to estrogen receptors. And then in the 80s, genistein was identified as an inhibitor of tyrosine kinase. This is an enzyme that's frequently overexpressed in cancer cells. And this led to research on isoflavones as being cancer preventative. And in the 90s, there was a lot of enthusiasm, and this is based on the low cancer rates in Japan, along with high soy intake in Japan. And there was also some studies showing that soy inhibited breast cancer in rats. And this led to funding from the National Cancer Institute for research in this area. And then in 2001, there were several animal studies that came out that showed that the more processed forms of soy led to high levels of circulating genistein and greater tumor growth. and that they concluded that genistein fueled estrogen receptor positive breast cancer. And this created a lot of fear about soy, consuming soy from foods. And you can even see here later in 2006, there was an American Cancer Society guideline that said to limit dietary soy and avoid soy isoflavone dietary supplements. And then later in 2011, the study that's cited down here from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition showed that the processing of soy doesn't affect the circulating levels of genistein in humans, unlike what they had found in the animal studies. They also found that there were differences in the metabolism of soy isoflavones between rats and mice, and also between rats and mice and humans. And this helped explain why there was so much conflict between these population studies that showed an association of high soy intake and lower risk of breast cancer, and the results of the animal studies from the early 2000s. And really, this is a classic example of why we don't make dietary recommendations based solely on animal research. Yeah, so what we know now is that soy foods are considered healthy and safe. In 2020, the American Cancer Society updated their guideline to basically recommend soy as part of a healthful diet, and to along with the recommendation to include 3 cups of vegetables and 2 cups of fruit per day. And across populations, studies point to soy possibly protecting against some cancers and presenting no increased risk for cancer. And it may reduce the risk of breast cancer recurrence. Now, and observational studies have also shown that higher intakes of soy during childhood and adolescence is associated with lower risk of breast cancer later in life. And the National Institute of Health has concluded that soy is safe, but it's uncertain whether or not soy isoflavone supplements are safe. And then they've also indicated that soy may be protective against prostate cancer for non-fermented soy foods. And that would be soybeans, soy milk, and tofu. You know, the FDA has not approved the use of soy as a treatment for cancer or any other medical condition. But I wanted to highlight what a moderate amount of soy is. So what is being recommended here? So the general guidance is for up to 100 milligrams of isoflavones per day. So what does that look like in terms of foods and the amounts? So you can see here different soy products like miso paste. This is not miso soup, it's the paste. For the soup, it would be diluted. And soybeans and soy milk. So you can see there's some variability between the soy milk and the soybeans in terms of the isoflavone content. But up to 1 to 3 servings of foods per day appears to be safe and healthful. And this is not linked to increased risk of breast cancer. In postmenopausal women, this may help maintain and increase bone mineral density. We don't know the health effects of having more than 100 milligrams of soy isoflavones per day. It's possible this may promote breast cancer growth, metastasis, or potentially interfere with the effects of hormone therapies like tamoxifen. And there's really no long-term safety of soy supplements that's been established. That said, there's also no guidelines for limiting the other types of phytoestrogens from food. So I think it's worth noting that soy is not only safe, it's also healthful and can serve as a high quality source of protein in meals. It's high in healthful fats and fiber. And we know that eating beans is in line with national dietary recommendations for health and for cancer prevention and survivorship. And so the other question that comes up quite frequently is whether or not these phytoestrogen supplements reduce hot flashes or not. And when it comes to dietary supplements, I always recommend individualized evaluations with your medical team. Speak with your physician, your dietitian, your pharmacist before starting a new supplement. We know dietary supplements in the United States are very poorly regulated, so they need to be taken with a lot of caution. So for soy isoflavones, this information actually applies to both the isoflavone supplements as well as soy foods. So some studies have shown that about 35 to 100 milligrams of soy isoflavones reduce the frequency of hot flashes. But then there's other studies saying that these are really no better than a placebo, and it doesn't appear to improve hot flashes from androgen deprivation therapy. According to consumer lab reports, they've indicated that these supplements, in order to be effective or for the food to be effective, it must include genistein and dazione. And we know that soy isoflavone supplement may potentially increase breast cancer in postmenopausal women with a family history of breast cancer. So I really want to exercise a lot of caution if considering a soy isoflavone dietary supplement. We also know that these can interfere with tamoxifen and aromatase inhibitors. And we know that they interfere with simvastatin, which is a medication for high cholesterol, as well as levothyroxine or Synthroid, which is a medication for hypothyroidism. That said, one can safely take or consume soy with Synthroid. You just have to, avoid eating. Synthroid should be taken on an empty stomach anyway. So with red clover, there's really insufficient evidence to support its use. It contains an estrogen. It contains biotannin A, which is a phytoestrogen and known to be estrogenic. The studies on it have really shown mixed results, and you want to exercise caution with hormone therapy because it is estrogenic. Dong Quai is another one. This is a root that's used in traditional Chinese medicine. There's really insufficient and contradictory evidence to support its use. Some studies show that it may be helpful when included with other ingredients, but it really appears to be ineffective alone. And it does have estrogenic activity, so one would want to exercise caution if considering this. Milk thistle seems to be ineffective as well and has concerns about its use with hormone therapies. In terms of licorice, again, there's really lack of evidence to support its use, and licorice interferes with multiple medications, including hormone therapy. Licorice supplements, not the candy or the tea, have been associated with hypokalemic hypertension. So this is something one would want to avoid. Another one that's sometimes looked at is chest tree berry, but this appears to be ineffective as well. Okay, so this is the other big topic that comes up quite frequently. Is bioengineered soy safe? We know that soy is a cash crop for the United States. We grow this and sell it nationally as well as internationally. Soy is used for animal feed. It's used as a cooking oil. It's also an ingredient in processed foods. So what is bioengineered soy? I think most of us are probably used to the term GMO or genetically modified. The new term is bioengineered. And this is really food that's been created through genetic engineering rather than being modified over time through selective or crossbreeding practices. But basically, it's the same thing as GMO. We know that in the United States, most of the soybeans are bioengineered, and they have been, most are considered Roundup ready. So they've been modified to withstand glyphosate, which is a herbicide in Roundup. So basically they can spray the soybeans with Roundup and it will kill the weeds around them but not kill the plant itself. And according to the USDA, if you don't specifically purchase a non-bioengineered soybean, you can assume that it is, because most soy in the US is bioengineered. The concern about glyphosate, though, is that it's been linked to health risks and environmental concerns. It also appears to impact biodiversity and may cause herbicide-resistant weeds. And to go full circle here, there's still some debate among experts about whether or not glyphosate is a xenoestrogen or not. Regulatory agencies in the US and Europe state that it's not, but there's still some recent scientific debate about this in terms of how these studies are done, how it's measured, and so forth. The other concern about glyphosate is that it's listed as a probable carcinogen by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And it can carry California's Prop 65 warning. This is a warning placed on foods or products that carry chemicals in them known to cause cancer or reproductive harm. Consumer Lab Reports has concluded that it's unlikely any food product will exceed this very stringent California Prop 65 warning limit. So we aren't going to see this very often. And I should point out that in January of last year, the USDA updated our labeling for bioengineered or genetically modified foods to include these images up here. So they may say bioengineered or derived from bioengineering. If they don't have one of those, it's possible that they have a QR code or a text for more information for foods that have been genetically modified. And the safety of these bioengineered crops has been extensively studied and reviewed by regulatory agencies around the world, but there is still some disagreement among regulatory and health organizations, as well as consumer advocacy groups, like the Environmental Working Group and Consumer Lab Reports. And so the issue with bioengineered soy may be less of a human nutrition issue and more of an environmental health issue. We know that glyphosate can harm native plants, affect wildlife, enter waterways, and affect marine life, and that overuse can lead to glyphosate-resistant weeds, which may require more herbicides, and soil tillage, which may result in soil erosion. So this can greatly impact the environment. And so these are some things to consider when grocery shopping and when considering purchasing soy or soy-based foods like tofu. If you are someone that wants to avoid bioengineered soy, you can look for food that has one of these two labels. If a food carries the USDA organic label, then it's not bioengineered. And there's also this non-GMO project verified label with a butterfly that would indicate that a food is not bioengineered as well. And then I wanted to end this with a quote from Wendell Berry. This is from his essay on the pleasures of eating. He states that eating is an agricultural act. And with that, we have time for questions. Give me just a second. Okay, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you so much, Megan. So I'm going to look through the chat for questions, and if there are none, I always have a few for you. So let me start with the easier one, because we've discussed this before. So you're generally conveying that soy might be a part of a healthy diet. Can you just give a quick assessment of soybean oil, though?
Yeah, soybean oil is it has a lot of uses. It can withstand high temperatures, and it's often mixed in vegetable oils. And because it's something that's grown in the US and there's a lot of production of soybeans, it's generally cheaper of the oils. But in terms of its fatty acid profile, it does tend to be higher in omega-6 fatty acids when compared to other cooking oils like avocado oil or olive oil.
And I just want to remind everyone that you may not be cooking with soybean oil in your home, but I could assure you the packaged foods, restaurant foods, mass-produced foods is often using that. So keep that in mind. Okay. The other thing I want to ask you, and this might be more complicated, but clearly, for example, Japanese have fewer rates of breast cancer compared to us in the United States, and there's no denying that. There are some in the kind of integrative world that argue that if any of this has to do, and of course this is probably multifaceted, but if any of this has to do with the soy part of the equation, that it may be because the Japanese are using more fermented soy products like natto and tempeh and whatnot. I'm curious on your thoughts on that, number one. And then number two, if somebody wants to purchase these things, I mean, when I go to Ralph's or Trader Joe's, you can't really readily find it. Where would you recommend somebody to go to get natto? It's not readily available in my mind.
Well, the soy intake in the US is very, very low compared to Japan. We Americans are not generally large consumers of soy products to begin with. So I think it's something that, personally, when I look for these products, I go to Trader Joe's, I go to Whole Foods, I go to Ralph's and other grocery stores, and I can find tofu very easily. I also really like baked tofu. I don't know if you've ever seen that. For anyone that's kind of a tofu novice, the idea of dehydrating it and flavoring it may be kind of overwhelming, but they do sell it flavored and vacuum sealed so that it's ready to eat. And you can find organic versions of these as well. You can also find soybeans either in the refrigerator section or even in the freezer section, and incorporate those into things like stir fries or salads or even just as a snack. So those are often readily available. In terms of tempeh, I do see it. Usually it's next to the tofu. Natto is something that you'd want to go to a Japanese grocery store to look for. I've never seen natto. Not to say that it's not there. I just haven't seen it. I often see miso paste and I've seen it in Whole Foods. I haven't seen it in Ralph's. So it's, these are available. And it's a learning curve for how to use some of these products because culturally it's not something that we tend to use, but I encourage you to try them and try to incorporate them into your diet because they do appear to be healthful and quite flavorful as well.
So would you give a similar assessment? Because I'm thinking, again, from some of these circles that these fermented soy products might have some of these other
Yes.
benefits. And also, from my reading that if it's not fermented, you may have more, is it phytic acid, PHYTIC, which might decrease absorption, some people claim with certain minerals. I don't know if you buy into that.
Well, I think fermented foods are generally healthful foods, but looking at the information about prostate cancer specifically, they showed that it was the non-fermented soy foods that had the greatest benefit. So I think there's benefit to consuming both. I mean, I'm always a fan of consuming beans in any form. We know that those are healthful foods, and soybean falls into that category. I know that some of the fermented foods, like natto, may be an acquired taste as well. It may not be something that it's so easily incorporated. But miso, I think, is pretty acceptable and something that one could try, as well as tempeh. So the non-fermented soy products are going to be the soybeans, soy milk, and tofu, and the fermented are going to be the tempeh, the natto, and the miso.
Great. And if there are no other questions from the audience, I'm going to ask one more. I'm going to look to see if anyone else has anything. But your thoughts on soy sauce? and if you have any thoughts there, when you go to an Asian market, you'll see 100 different brands of soy sauce. What would you recommend, if anything, in that space?
Soy sauce contains sodium, right? So that's something to be aware of. It's high sodium. I usually go for the low sodium options. It's very flavorful though, and adds that, desirable umami taste to foods. There's different versions of soy sauce. There's mushroom flavored soy sauces. They can have a varying degree of flavor and intensity. But I would treat it just like you would salt, because usually if you're adding soy sauce to a food or a dish, you're not also adding table salt or iodized salt or any other form of salt.
Okay, great. We had a couple comments. Somebody mentioned that Ralph's has miso paste. I did not know that. Thank you for letting me know. Somebody mentioned there are other sessions like this and other topics. Is that available on the website now, Megan? Are you aware?
I don't think it's available on the website, but we could create some accessibility to that.
It is one of our goals to see how we can have a database that could be available. So I appreciate the question, but we're going to be doing this at least, it's about every quarter, and we're going to look at the cadence just depending on how this goes over. And again, these were meant to be relatively short, kind of in focus sessions. just to be respectful of everyone's time, because I know we're all busy. But thank you all so much. Stephanie also mentioned that the Hollywood Farmers Market has miso paste, so thanks for the tip.
Thanks. I always appreciate
well,
it when you share tips like this.
yeah, very useful. Thank you all so much. Hope you have a wonderful